A massive sinkhole in a fourth-generation family farm, revealing an elaborate network of stone chambers and tunnels. One struggling farmer's unexpected discovery that would transform not just his family's future, but an entire community's understanding of its origins and potentially heal bitter divisions that had plagued the region for generations. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The relentless spring rain hammered against the windows of Ethan Mercer's farmhouse as he stared dejectedly at the foreclosure notice on his kitchen table. At 42, the former agricultural sciences professor had returned to Willow Creek Farm 4 years ago after his father's sudden death, abandoning a promising academic career to preserve the family legacy. With just $4,172, 16 in his bank account, and 3 consecutive failed harvests, he now faced the very real possibility of losing the 120 acres that had been in the Mercer family since 1868. "Dad, when can we check on the north field?" called 13-year-old Lily from the mudroom where she was pulling on rubber boots. His daughter had adapted to farm life with remarkable enthusiasm, embracing country living despite leaving behind her friends and the comfortable suburban life they'd once known. The non-stop downpour had kept them mostly indoors for 3 days, but Lily remained determined to help prepare for spring planting, if they could afford the seed this year. "Still pouring out there, honey. Let's wait until it lets up a bit," Ethan replied, quickly tucking the foreclosure notice into a drawer. He didn't have the heart to tell her that this planting season might be their last on Willow Creek Farm. The county had already received inquiries from developers eager to transform the fertile farmland into a sprawling commercial complex. The phone's sharp ring interrupted his thoughts. The caller ID displayed Millfield Bank. Ethan braced himself for another uncomfortable conversation about late payments. Instead, the bank manager's voice carried unexpected news. "Mr. Mercer, we've been contacted by the county emergency management team. There's been a significant land collapse on your north property line near the Shelves Limestone Formation. They're sending someone out to assess potential hazards, but you should inspect the damage as soon as it's safe to do so." Ethan thanked him and hung up, concern mounting. The north field represented their best planting area, and any significant damage could eliminate whatever slim chance remained of a profitable season. "Change of plans," he told Lily, grabbing his rain gear. "Something's happened in the north. Revealed we need to check it out." 20 minutes later, their mud-splattered pickup truck bounced along the rutted farm road toward the northern section of their property. The rain had finally subsided to a light drizzle, but dark clouds still hung low over the sodden landscape. As they crested the gentle rise that separated the farmhouse from the north field, Ethan slammed on the brakes, stunned by what lay before them. A massive sinkhole, nearly 40 feet across, had opened in the center of the field, swallowing a section of topsoil and revealing dark gaps in the limestone beneath. But this wasn't the random collapse typical of karst topography. Even from a distance, Ethan could see deliberate stonework patterns around what appeared to be an entry point into the earth itself. "Dad, look!" Lily pointed excitedly. "That's not natural. Someone built that." Ethan approached cautiously, keeping Lily safely behind him as they neared the edge. The collapse had exposed what looked like a stone archway leading to a chamber. Below, carefully constructed walls were visible where the soil had fallen away, revealing expert masonry that had remained hidden beneath their fields for generations. "This isn't just a cave or natural formation," Ethan murmured, his agricultural sciences background immediately recognizing the deliberate construction. "This is man-made and old, really old." Before they could investigate further, the sound of an approaching vehicle drew their attention. A county emergency management truck pulled up, and a woman in a rain jacket emblazoned with the county logo approached. "Mr. Mercer? I'm Sarah Jones from Emergency Management. We received reports of a potential sinkhole on your property." She stopped abruptly when she saw the exposed stonework. "That's not what I was expecting." "Neither was I," Ethan admitted. "This looks like some sort of underground structure." Sarah made a quick call to her office, and within hours, the quiet farm field had transformed into a hub of activity. County officials, geological survey representatives, and curious neighbors gathered around the mysterious opening, speculating about its origin and purpose. By late afternoon, Dr. Eleanor Thorne from the Riverdale Historical Society had arrived, her eyes wide with excitement as she examined the stonework. At 65, she'd spent decades studying the region's settlement patterns, but had never encountered anything like this. "This masonry style is consistent with mid-19th century construction techniques," she told Ethan as she carefully photographed the exposed archway. "But there's no record of any underground structure in this location. Nothing in county archives or historical surveys mentions anything built beneath Willow Creek Farm." Ethan's neighbor, Frank Thompson, scratched his head in bewilderment. "My family's been next door for 5 generations, and we never heard about any underground buildings around here." As the crowd grew, a sleek black SUV pulled up, and Victoria Blackwell emerged. Impeccably dressed despite the muddy surroundings, the executive from Oak Ridge Development Corporation surveyed the scene with calculating interest. "Mr. Mercer," she called, approaching with a practiced smile. "I was in the area when I heard about your discovery. Quite the commotion for a simple sinkhole." "It's not just a sinkhole," Lily said proudly. "It's a historic structure." Victoria's expression shifted subtly as she peered over the edge. "Indeed. Well, if you decide this is more trouble than it's worth, Oak Ridge's offer to purchase your property still stands. We could take this problem off your hands and resolve your financial difficulties in the process." Her pointed glance at Ethan's mud-splattered truck and weathered barn made it clear she knew about his precarious situation. Before Ethan could respond, Martha Sullivan's ancient station wagon puttered up the farm road. At 82, the town's oldest, resident rarely left her home these days, but news of the discovery had clearly drawn her out. With assistance from Dr. Thorne, she made her way to the sinkhole's edge. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Martha whispered, her wrinkled face a mixture of awe and what Ethan thought might be relief. "Raymond swore he'd take the secret to his grave." "Raymond?" Ethan asked sharply. "You mean my grandfather?" Martha nodded slowly. "He and my late husband were childhood friends. Sometimes, after a few drinks, Raymond would hint about what lay beneath the North Field. We all thought it was just tall tales." As darkness approached, county officials established a temporary security perimeter around the sinkhole, promising to return with proper archaeological experts the following day. The crowds gradually dispersed, leaving Ethan and Lily alone with the mystery beneath their failing farm. That evening, as rain once again drummed against the windows, Ethan searched. Through his grandfather's belongings stored in the attic, among weather-worn farm ledgers and faded photographs, he discovered a locked metal box he'd never noticed before. Without a key, he was forced to break the rusted lock with a screwdriver. Inside lay a leather-bound journal stamped with the name Thomas Mercer, 1868, Ethan's great-great-grandfather who had established the farm. Beneath it rested an old brass key attached to a faded tag marked simply "The Network." "Dad, look what I found," Lily called from across the attic. She held up a rolled parchment that had fallen behind an old dresser. When carefully unfolded, it revealed a detailed map of Willow Creek Farm, with intricate tunnels and chambers drawn beneath the north field. Notations in faded ink marked meeting chamber, storage, and most intriguingly, Westbrook connection. Westbrook? Ethan murmured, as in the Westbrook family that founded Cedar Springs. The Westbrooks had been the region's industrial pioneers, establishing the mills and factories that transformed Cedar Springs into a prosperous city, while the surrounding farmland remained relatively poor. For generations, an unspoken tension had existed between the agricultural communities like Millfield and the industrial centers championed by the Westbrooks and their allies. Ethan stayed up late into the night reading Thomas Mercer's journal by lamplight after Lily had gone to bed. The entries described the secret construction of an underground network connecting key farms and properties throughout Riverdale County. But contrary to the region's accepted history of division between farming and industrial interest, preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The journal revealed an astonishing truth. The network had been jointly created by agricultural families like the Mercers and industrial pioneers, like the Westbrooks, as a cooperative venture during a time of economic hardship. April 16th, 1868. Today marks the completion of the main chamber beneath the North Field, one entry read. William Westbrook himself laid the final cornerstone alongside me, though few would believe we have found common purpose after our public disagreements. What the county perceives as bitter rivalry has become our greatest protection as we work in secret towards shared prosperity. The journal detailed how the economic panic of 1857 had nearly destroyed both agricultural and industrial interests in the region. Rather than succumb to failure, the competing factions had secretly united, creating underground storage and meeting facilities to protect grain reserves, manufacturing materials, and financial resources from both natural disasters and potential economic predators from neighboring counties. We maintain our public differences, Thomas wrote, while beneath the surface, we have created a community of mutual support that crosses all traditional boundaries. Most surprising were entries suggesting that when prosperity returned, powerful commercial interests from outside the region had actively worked to re-establish divisions between the agricultural and industrial communities, finding it easier to control both when they remained separated. Ethan could hardly believe what he was reading. The entire historical narrative of Riverdale County, the generational divisions between farming communities like Millfield and industrial centers like Cedar Springs that persisted into modern politics, appeared to be based on deliberately perpetuated misconceptions. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of vehicles approaching. Looking out his window, he was alarmed to see several unmarked vans and a county truck arriving before the scheduled archaeological team. Commissioner Howard Jenkins stepped out, accompanied by Victoria Blackwell from Oak Ridge Development. Grabbing his jacket, Ethan hurried outside to intercept them before they reached the sinkhole. "Commissioner, I wasn't expecting anyone this early." Jenkins offered a thin smile. "My family's been next door for 5 generations, and we never heard about any underground buildings around here." As the crowd grew, a sleek black SUV pulled up, and Victoria Blackwell emerged, impeccably dressed despite the muddy surroundings. The executive from Oak Ridge Development Corporation surveyed the scene with calculating interest. "Mr. Mercer," she called, approaching with a practiced smile. "I was in the area when I heard about your discovery. Quite the commotion for a simple sinkhole." "It's not just a sinkhole," Lily said proudly. "It's a historic structure." Victoria's expression shifted subtly as she peered over the edge. "Indeed. Well, if you decide this is more trouble than it's worth, Oak Ridge's offer to purchase your property still stands. We could take this problem off your hands and resolve your financial difficulties in the process." Her pointed glance at Ethan's mud-splattered truck and weathered barn made it clear she knew about his precarious situation. Before Ethan could respond, Martha Sullivan's ancient station wagon puttered up the farm road. At 82, the town's oldest, resident rarely left her home these days, but news of the discovery had clearly drawn her out. With assistance from Dr. Thorne, she made her way to the sinkhole's edge. "I never thought I'd live to see this day," Martha whispered, her wrinkled face a mixture of awe and what Ethan thought might be relief. Raymond swore he'd take the secret to his grave. "Raymond?" Ethan asked sharply. "You mean my grandfather?" Martha nodded slowly. "He and my late husband were childhood friends. Sometimes, after a few drinks, Raymond would hint about what lay beneath the North Field. We all thought it was just tall tales." As darkness approached, county officials established a temporary security perimeter around the sinkhole, promising to return with proper archaeological experts the following day. The crowds gradually dispersed, leaving Ethan and Lily alone with the mystery beneath their failing farm. That evening, as rain once again drummed against the windows, Ethan searched through his grandfather's belongings stored in the attic. Among weather-worn farm ledgers and faded photographs, he discovered a locked metal box he'd never noticed before. Without a key, he was forced to break the rusted lock with a screwdriver. Inside lay a leather-bound journal stamped with the name Thomas Mercer, 1868, Ethan's great-great-grandfather who had established the farm. Beneath it rested an old brass key attached to a faded tag marked simply, "The Network." "Dad, look what I found!" Lily called from across the attic. She held up a rolled parchment that had fallen behind an old dresser. When carefully unfolded, it revealed a detailed map of Willow Creek Farm, with intricate tunnels and chambers drawn beneath the North Field. Notations in faded ink marked meeting chamber, storage, and most intriguingly, Westbrook connection. "Westbrook," Ethan murmured. "As in the Westbrook family that founded Cedar Springs?" The Westbrooks had been the region's industrial pioneers, establishing the mills and factories that transformed Cedar Springs into a prosperous city, while the surrounding farmland remained relatively poor. For generations, an unspoken tension had existed between the agricultural communities like Millfield and the industrial centers, championed by the Westbrooks and their allies. Ethan stayed up late into the night, reading Thomas Mercer's journal by lamplight after Lily had gone to bed. The entries described the secret construction of an underground network connecting key farms and properties throughout Riverdale County. But contrary to the region's accepted history of division between farming and industrial interests, the journal revealed an astonishing truth. The network had been jointly created by agricultural families like the Mercers and industrial pioneers, like the Westbrooks, as a cooperative venture during a time of economic hardship. April 16th, 1868. Today marks the completion of the main chamber beneath the North Field, one entry read. William Westbrook himself laid the final cornerstone alongside me, though few would believe we have found common purpose after our public disagreements. What the county perceives as bitter rivalry has become our greatest protection as we work in secret toward shared prosperity. The journal detailed how the economic panic of 1857 had nearly destroyed both agricultural and industrial interests in the region. Rather than succumb to failure, the competing factions had secretly united, creating underground storage and meeting facilities to protect grain reserves, manufacturing materials, and financial resources from both natural disasters and potential economic predators from neighboring counties. "We maintain our public differences," Thomas wrote, "while beneath the surface we have created a community of mutual support that crosses all traditional boundaries." Most surprising were entries suggesting that when prosperity returned, powerful commercial interests from outside the region had actively worked to re-establish divisions between the agricultural and industrial communities, finding it easier to control both when they remained separated. Ethan could hardly believe what he was reading. The entire historical narrative of Riverdale County, the generational divisions between farming communities like Millfield and industrial centers like Cedar Springs that persisted into modern politics, appeared to be based on deliberately perpetuated misconceptions. The next morning, Ethan awoke to the sound of vehicles approaching. Looking out his window, he was alarmed to see several unmarked vans and a county truck arriving before the scheduled archaeological team. Commissioner Howard Jenkins stepped out, accompanied by Victoria Blackwell from Oak Ridge Development. Grabbing his jacket, Ethan hurried outside to intercept them before they reached the sinkhole. "Commissioner, I wasn't expecting anyone this early." Jenkins offered a thin smile. That evening, an extraordinary meeting took place in Ethan's farmhouse kitchen. Margaret Westbrook had arrived with her own family records, ledgers, correspondence, and most significantly, a matching journal kept by William Westbrook during the same period as Thomas Mercer's writings. "Our families weren't enemies," Margaret explained as they compared documents. "They were partners who created a public illusion of rivalry to protect their cooperative ventures from outside interests that sought to control the region's resources." The Westbrook Journal confirmed Thomas Mercer's account, but added crucial details about why the truth had been suppressed. When economic stability returned, powerful banking and commercial entities from neighboring regions had recognized that controlling the area's resources would be easier if agricultural and industrial interests remained divided. "My grandfather wrote that by 1890 it became dangerous to acknowledge the network's existence," Margaret continued. "Outside commercial interests actively fostered animosity between farming and industrial communities, eventually convincing each side that the other was responsible for their hardships." Dr. Thorne nodded grimly. "And those divisions became so entrenched that they evolved into the modern political and social gaps between communities like Millfield and Cedar Springs." Ethan spread Thomas Mercer's map across the table. "According to this, the network connected at least 7 properties throughout the county, creating a literal underground community that crossed all the supposed boundaries." Martha Sullivan, who had joined their discussion, pointed a gnarled finger at specific tunnels. "My husband used to say that his grandfather claimed you could travel from Cedar Springs to Millfield without ever seeing daylight. We thought it was just tall tales." As they discussed the historical implications, Lily, who had been quietly listening, suddenly asked the question that had been bothering Ethan. "But why did our families stop using the network? Why let everyone forget it existed?" Margaret Westbrook exchanged glances with Martha. "According to family records, there was an incident in 1919, a partial collapse in one section that killed 2 people. The county government, already heavily influenced by outside commercial interests, used the tragedy to declare the entire network unsafe and order it sealed. And both families complied rather than fight the order," Ethan surmised. "They had little choice," Margaret replied. By then, the manufactured divisions had become so entrenched that public opinion would have been impossible to overcome. Our great-grandparents decided to preserve the truth in family records, while allowing the physical evidence to remain hidden until a time when revealing it might actually heal rather than further divide. Over the next several days, the discovery beneath Willow Creek Farm became the center of increasing attention and controversy. Professor Rivera's team began systematic documentation of the main chamber, while county officials, led by Commissioner Jenkins, attempted to limit access, citing safety concerns. Victoria Blackwell maintained a constant presence, increasing Oak Ridge's purchase offer almost daily, while simultaneously filing permits for emergency demolition of dangerous underground structures that would effectively destroy any evidence before it could be properly studied. Ethan, facing the approaching bank deadline that could cost him the farm, found himself torn between financial survival and historical responsibility. The situation reached a critical point when he received notice that the county commission had scheduled an emergency hearing about the fate of the underground discovery. They're moving quickly to seize control of the narrative, Dr. Thorne warned when she called with the news. If they declare it a public safety hazard requiring immediate remediation, everything will be destroyed before we can complete proper documentation. Jonathan Parker, the attorney Margaret Westbrook had arranged to represent Ethan, concurred. This is clearly an attempt to bury the historical significance, quite literally, before its implications can challenge established interests. The night before the hearing, Ethan found Lily sitting on the farmhouse porch, staring toward the north field, where security lights now illuminated the excavation area. "Are we going to lose the farm?" she asked quietly. Ethan sat beside her, choosing honesty over false reassurance. "The bank deadline is getting closer, and fighting the county commission will be difficult." "But what about all that history? The network shows that people work together instead of fighting. That seems important." "It is important," Ethan agreed. "Maybe more important than keeping the farm, if it helps heal divisions that should have ended generations ago." Lily considered this. Great-great-great-grandpa Thomas would want us to tell the truth, wouldn't he? Even if it means losing his farm. Ethan put his arm around his daughter. "I think he preserved the truth, hoping someday it would be more valuable than the land itself." The Cedar Springs County Administration building was packed beyond capacity. For the emergency hearing, what had been scheduled as a routine safety assessment had transformed into something much more significant as word spread about the historical implications of the underground network. Residents from both Millfield and Cedar Springs filled the chamber, traditional divisions momentarily set aside in shared curiosity about the discovery that challenged their regional identity. Commissioner Jenkins appeared visibly unsettled by the unexpected public interest. Victoria Blackwell had assembled an impressive array of engineering experts who presented detailed reports about structural dangers, emphasizing immediate hazard mitigation over historical preservation. The testimony was technically convincing, but conspicuously avoided addressing the historical significance of the structures. When Ethan's turn came to address the commission, he found himself unexpectedly calm, despite the high stakes. Rather than arguing technical details, he focused on the fundamental truth revealed by the network. "What we've discovered beneath Willow Creek Farm isn't just stone and mortar," he began, placing Thomas Mercer's journal on the podium. "It's evidence that our region's deepest divisions, the supposed unbridgeable gap between agricultural and industrial interests that has shaped our politics and community relations for generations, was deliberately manufactured and maintained." A murmur ran through the audience as Ethan explained how the journals and physical evidence revealed cooperation rather than conflict between the founding families. Margaret Westbrook then presented her family's corresponding documentation, creating a powerful unified front that bridged the very division their ancestors had been forced to publicly maintain. Professor Rivera followed with archaeological evidence, confirming the network's sophisticated construction and clear symbolic representations of unity between the supposedly rival factions. Dr. Thorne presented historical context, showing how outside commercial interests had benefited from keeping the regional communities divided. Commissioner Jenkins attempted to redirect the discussion back to safety concerns, but the historical revelation had clearly captured the community's imagination. When Victoria Blackwell rose to emphasize Oak Ridge Development's safety concerns, she found herself facing an increasingly skeptical audience. The commission chairperson, visibly moved by the historical evidence, proposed a compromise: a 60-day moratorium on any decisions regarding the underground structures to allow for proper archaeological documentation and historical assessment. During this period, temporary preservation measures would secure both safety and historical integrity. For Ethan, the moratorium provided breathing room but didn't resolve his immediate financial crisis. As the hearing concluded, he prepared himself to accept that preserving this historical truth might indeed cost him his family's farm. Then Martha Sullivan approached the podium, her frail voice amplified by unexpected determination. "There's something else you should all know," she announced. "Raymond Mercer didn't just preserve knowledge about the network, he established a trust." The elderly woman explained that decades ago, Ethan's grandfather had created a legal arrangement with several other families descended from network founders. The trust had quietly purchased surrounding properties as they became available, gradually reassembling land that had once been connected by the underground system. The trust has specific provisions that activate if the network is ever rediscovered, Martha explained, including resources to preserve both the historical structures and the associated properties, including Willow Creek Farm. Jonathan Parker confirmed this unexpected revelation, explaining that as trustee, he had been legally prohibited from disclosing the trust's existence until the network was publicly acknowledged. The trust resources would not only resolve Ethan's immediate financial crisis, but establish a foundation for preserving and studying the historical discovery. In the weeks that followed, Willow Creek Farm transformed from a failing agricultural property into the center of a community revitalization effort. The 60-day moratorium extended into permanent historical designation as archaeological teams carefully documented the extensive underground network that connected multiple properties throughout Riverdale County. Most significantly, the historical revelation began healing community divisions that had persisted for generations. Residents from both agricultural and industrial backgrounds discovered their shared heritage of cooperation, challenging political and social boundaries that had long been accepted as inevitable. Victoria Blackwell and Oak Ridge Development eventually withdrew their interest in the property, though rumors suggested the company faced significant investor questions about their aggressive pursuit of the land despite its historical significance. Commissioner Jenkins, whose connections to development interests became increasingly apparent during subsequent investigations, opted not to run for re-election. 2 years later, Ethan stood at the entrance to the carefully preserved main chamber, now part of the Riverdale Heritage Center that welcomed visitors from across the country. The educational facility, built beside the original farmhouse, presented the true history of regional cooperation, alongside exhibits demonstrating how manufactured divisions had shaped community relationships for over a century. Lily, now 15, had become one of the center's most enthusiastic volunteer guides, proudly explaining to visitors how her family had preserved truth through generations until the right moment for its revelation. "Dad," she called, hurrying toward him with a school tablet. "My history project got selected for the state competition. It's about how rediscovering historical truth can heal modern divisions." The North Field that had once represented Ethan's desperate hope for agricultural survival now flourished with heritage crops grown using both traditional methods and sustainable innovations, a living demonstration of how agricultural and industrial approaches could complement rather than oppose each other. Margaret Westbrook had become a regular visitor, working with Ethan to establish scholarship programs that brought students from throughout the region to study the historical lessons of the network. The manufactured boundaries between Millfield and Cedar Springs had begun to dissolve as community members recognized their shared heritage and interests. What had begun as a catastrophe, a sinkhole threatening his last productive field, had transformed into something Ethan could never have imagined, not just financial survival, but meaningful purpose. The unwanted family legacy he had reluctantly assumed had revealed its true value not in acres or crops, but in a historical truth with the power to heal divisions that should have ended generations earlier. As visitors explored the illuminated underground chambers that his ancestors had helped create, Ethan reflected on Thomas Mercer's final journal entry. "We preserve this truth beneath the soil, knowing we may not live to see its revelation. But we trust that when the time comes, it will prove more valuable than any harvest our land could ever yield." The accidental discovery beneath Willow Creek Farm had done exactly that, yielding a crop of reconciliation and understanding far more precious than any the surface soil could have produced. Ethan Mercer awoke before dawn the next morning, his mind still racing with questions about the mysterious underground network discovered beneath his failing farm. After tossing and turning most of the night, he'd made a decision. Before engaging further with county officials or entertaining more offers from Oak Ridge Development, he needed to understand exactly what his ancestors had built beneath Willow Creek Farm and why it had been kept secret for generations. He brewed coffee in the kitchen of the weathered farmhouse that had seen 5 generations of Mercers come and go. The foreclosure notice still sat in the drawer where he'd hidden it from Lily, a constant reminder of the financial precipice they balanced upon. Pulling out his grandfather's journal again, he reread the passages describing the initial construction of the network in 1868. Something about the specific language nagged at him. References to secured repositories and protected exchanges that suggested the underground chambers might have served purposes beyond simple meetings and storage. "You're up early again," Lily observed, shuffling into the kitchen still. In her pajamas, her hair tousled from sleep. Despite their precarious situation, seeing his daughter's resilience continually amazed him. She had adapted to farm life with enthusiasm and now faced the mysterious discovery with the same optimism. "Just reviewing great-great-great-grandpa Thomas's journal," Ethan replied, pouring her a glass of orange juice. "There are some details about the network I want to understand better before the archaeological team returns." "Did you see the part about the central repository?" Lily asked, leaning over to point at a notation in the margin of an entry from October 1868. It mentions something called the archive that sounds important. Ethan examined the faded handwriting, impressed by his daughter's observant nature. The margin note clearly indicated that beyond the main chamber they had already discovered, a more significant archive existed somewhere deeper in the network. A central repository containing documents and artifacts of particular importance. "Good catch, Lily," he said, mentally re-evaluating his impression of the network's extent. "This suggests what we've found so far is just the entrance to something much larger." After breakfast, they were surprised by an early visitor. Martha Sullivan's ancient station wagon puttered up the driveway. The elderly woman, accompanied by her grandson, Michael, a local history teacher from Millfield High School. "I couldn't sleep a wink thinking about what's been uncovered," Martha explained as Michael helped her navigate the porch steps. "There are things you should know before the county officials and those development people return." In the farmhouse kitchen, Martha revealed that her late husband had shared more information about the network than she had initially admitted. "William didn't just hear stories from his grandfather," she explained, pulling out a small leather pouch from her handbag. "He was one of the designated keepers, individuals from network families tasked with preserving knowledge of the underground system even after it was officially sealed." From the pouch, she produced a brass key similar to the one Ethan had found in his grandfather's box. but with more elaborate engravings. This opens something called the archive, supposedly the most important chamber in the entire network. William passed it to me before he died, saying it should go to the Mercer family if the network was ever rediscovered. Michael, who had been quietly listening, added, "Grandmother showed me family records indicating that the archive contains documentation that would rewrite regional history if ever revealed. That's probably why Commissioner Jenkins and Oak Ridge Development are so determined to gain control of the site." Ethan compared the ornate key with the rough map of the network. "There's no specific mention of an archive location on this map," he noted. "That was intentional," Martha explained. "The archive's exact location was known only to designated keepers from each founding family, but William always said it could be accessed from the main chamber beneath your north field." Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of vehicles approaching. Professor Rivera's archaeology team had returned as promised, accompanied by Dr. Eleanor Thorne from the Historical Society. To Ethan's dismay, Commissioner Jenkins's county vehicle was also among them, along with Victoria Blackwell's now familiar black SUV. "They're certainly persistent," Ethan muttered, tucking Martha's key into his pocket and the journals out of sight. Outside, Professor Rivera was already establishing the day's excavation protocols, his team unloading specialized equipment for a more thorough documentation of the main chamber. Victoria Blackwell stood off to one side, speaking intently into her phone while occasionally gesturing toward the sinkhole. "Mr. Mercer," Commissioner Jenkins called with forced congeniality, "I've brought county safety inspectors to ensure this excavation doesn't compromise surrounding land stability. We don't want neighboring properties affected by any further collapses." "That's thoughtful," Ethan replied, noting that the two men Jenkins introduced as safety inspectors carried equipment that seemed more suitable for rapid assessment than careful documentation. "Professor Rivera has already implemented comprehensive safety measures." Jenkins's smile tightened. "Nevertheless, the county has responsibilities that supersede academic interests. These gentlemen will need immediate access to evaluate potential hazards." Before Ethan could object, Dr. Thorne intervened, her academic authority providing timely support. "Commissioner, as you're aware, the State Historical Preservation Office granted preliminary protected status to this site yesterday afternoon. Any assessment must follow archaeological protocols to avoid damaging potential historical evidence." The commissioner's expression darkened momentarily before he recovered his political composure. Of course, safety and preservation must go hand in hand. Perhaps a joint inspection would satisfy all requirements." Professor Rivera agreed to a compromise, allowing one county inspector to accompany the archaeological team while the other remained above ground to assess the sinkhole's perimeter. This arrangement seemingly satisfied Jenkins, though Ethan noticed him exchange meaningful glances with Victoria Blackwell. As the archaeological team prepared for a more extensive exploration of the main chamber and its connecting tunnels, Ethan drew Professor Rivera aside, sharing what he had learned about the possible existence of a more significant archive somewhere deeper in the network. That would explain certain anomalies in the main chamber's construction, the professor mused. Several features suggest the chamber was designed as an antechamber rather than the network's central feature. Some tunnels appear to function as decoys, while others likely lead to more significant spaces. While the team prepared their equipment, Ethan noticed Lily engaged in animated conversation with Margaret Westbrook, who had arrived unannounced. The elderly Westbrook matriarch had brought additional family records and seemed genuinely invested in properly documenting the discovery that connected their family's histories. "Your daughter has a remarkable aptitude for historical investigation," Margaret commented when Ethan joined them. She's already identified connections between the Westbrook Mill operations and Mercer Farm productivity that suggest our family's coordinated planting and production cycles through the network. Lily beamed at the praise. The ledgers show harvest, deliveries that don't match official market records. They were using the underground tunnels to move crops directly to processing facilities, bypassing the commercial exchanges controlled by outside interests. Ethan felt a surge of pride in his daughter's insights, followed by a renewed determination to uncover the full extent of what lay beneath his struggling farm. The discovery had awakened something in both of them, a connection to their heritage that transcended the property's monetary value. By mid-morning, the archaeological team had established a stable access system using temporary supports and lighting. Professor Rivera proposed an initial exploration team consisting of himself, Ethan, as property owner, Dr. Thorne, representing the Historical Society, and the County Inspector Jenkins had insisted accompany them. "Dad, I want to come too," Lily protested when told she would remain above ground. "Next time," Ethan promised, "let us make sure everything is completely secure first." Martha Sullivan pulled Ethan aside before he descended. "The archive entrance will be marked with an interlocking wheel and wheat sheaf symbol," she whispered. "My husband said it would be positioned where it's not immediately obvious, likely in a section that appears to be a dead end." The descent into the main chamber felt different this time, more purposeful and significant. The archaeological team had installed temporary lighting that illuminated the skilled masonry and architectural features more clearly. Professor Rivera pointed out construction elements that would have been exceptionally sophisticated for rural 1860s America. The ventilation system alone represents engineering knowledge typically found only in major urban construction of that era, he explained, indicating subtle air channels incorporated into the walls. And these support arches distribute weight in a manner that's kept this structure intact despite lying beneath actively farmed land for over 150 years. This, while the professor and Dr. Thorne documented architectural features and the county inspector ostensibly assessed structural stability, Ethan carefully examined each tunnel entrance, looking for the symbol Martha had described. 3 tunnels extended from the main chamber, one with clear wheel symbols identifying it as connecting to Westbrook properties, another with wheat sheaf markings indicating agricultural connections, and a third that appeared partially collapsed. It was at this third tunnel, the seemingly impassable one, that Ethan finally spotted what he was seeking. Hidden in shadow beneath accumulated soil, an interlocking wheel and wheat sheaf emblem was carved into the keystone, exactly as Martha had described. To a casual observer, the tunnel appeared to be a dead end, rendered inaccessible by collapsed stone and soil, but Ethan now suspected this was deliberate camouflage. "Professor," he called, "there's something unusual about this tunnel section." Rivera examined the area with professional interest. "Fascinating. The collapse pattern doesn't match natural degradation. It almost appears staged. Note how the fallen stones create an impression of random failure while actually forming a stable configuration." The county inspector showed sudden interest. "That area looks particularly hazardous. We should avoid disturbing it until structural engineers can assess stability." Dr. Thorne, who had moved closer to examine the symbol Ethan had found, exchanged meaningful glances with him. "Perhaps we should focus our documentation on the more accessible tunnels first," she suggested, understanding Ethan's silent communication. "This section can wait for specialized assessment." They spent another hour documenting the main chamber's features, with Ethan noting the inspector taking numerous photographs and measurements that seemed excessive for safety evaluation. When they finally returned to the surface, Ethan wasn't surprised to see the inspector immediately engage in quiet conversation with Commissioner Jenkins and Victoria Blackwell. "They're looking for something specific," Dr. Thorne murmured as they removed their safety gear. "And I suspect it has to do with whatever lies beyond that disguised tunnel entrance." Ethan nodded, the brass key Martha had given him feeling suddenly heavy in his pocket. "I think it's time we found out what's in the archive before they figure out how to access it." That evening, after the archaeological team had departed with plans to return the following day, Ethan gathered a small group in the farmhouse kitchen: Lily, Dr. Thorne, Martha Sullivan and her grandson Michael, and Margaret Westbrook. These were people he instinctively trusted with the knowledge of the archive's potential location. "I believe I've found the entrance to what Martha's husband called the archive," he explained, describing the disguised tunnel and its hidden symbol. "But accessing it without alerting the county officials or Oak Ridge representatives will be challenging." Margaret Westbrook nodded thoughtfully. "Commissioner Jenkins has requested an emergency county commission meeting tomorrow afternoon regarding the safety hazards at Willow Creek Farm. I suspect they're planning some form of intervention that would give them control of the site." Dr. Thorne consulted the preliminary preservation order she had obtained. The emergency historical designation provides some protection, but if they can convince the commission that imminent safety concerns outweigh historical significance, they could still gain access for remediation purposes. "Then we need to document whatever's in the archive before tomorrow's meeting," Ethan decided. "If it contains evidence as significant as family records suggest, having that documentation could prevent them from burying the truth again." "You mean we're going down there tonight?" Lily asked, excitement overshadowing any apprehension. "A small team," Ethan clarified. "Dr. Thorne for proper archaeological protocol, myself as property owner, and Michael to document everything professionally." Michael Sullivan taught history, but had also worked as a documentary photographer, skills that would be valuable for quickly recording whatever they found. Martha handed the ornate brass key to Ethan. "William said this opens the main archive door, but he also mentioned a secondary security measure, something about founding dates serving as a combination of sorts." Margaret quickly provided the relevant information. The Westbrook Mill was established on May 17, 1852. The date has been preserved in family records as significant to the network. And the Mercer farm was purchased on August 23, 1855. Ethan added, recalling details from Thomas Mercer's journal. The network itself was apparently conceived during the Panic of 1857 and completed in 1868. With flashlights, safety equipment and cameras prepared, they waited until just after midnight to ensure no observers remained at the excavation site. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant above the farm fields that had sustained generations of Mercers. As they approached the secured entrance to the underground chamber, Ethan felt a profound connection to the land and its hidden history. The safety supports Professor Rivera installed should make this relatively straightforward, Dr. Thorne assured them as they carefully descended into the main chamber. "But we'll maintain communication with Margaret and Martha above ground at all times." The chamber appeared different in the focused beams of their flashlights, shadows creating new perspectives on the skilled stonework. They moved directly to the disguised tunnel entrance where Ethan had discovered the interlocking wheel and wheat sheaf symbol. "It's ingenious," Dr. Thorne observed, examining what had appeared to be collapsed stone blocking the passage. "These aren't random fallen rocks. They're carefully arranged to create the impression of an impassable tunnel, while actually concealing a functioning doorway." Following her archaeological expertise, they carefully removed specific stones that proved to be cleverly designed facade elements rather than structural components. Behind them lay a solid stone door with a brass keyhole positioned directly beneath the carved emblem. "This craftsmanship is remarkable," Michael commented, photographing each stage of their discovery. "The door is so precisely fitted to the surrounding stone that it's practically invisible unless you know exactly what to look for." Ethan inserted Martha's key into the lock, feeling a momentous connection to his ancestors as the mechanism turned with surprising smoothness despite its age. The door, perfectly balanced on hidden hinges, swung inward to reveal a short passage, leading to another, more elaborate door. This second barrier featured no keyhole, but instead had 5 stone discs arranged in a row, each inscribed with numbers from 0 to 9 that could be rotated to different positions. A combination lock built entirely of stone. The founding dates, Ethan realized. But which numbers from the dates would they use? After several attempts using different combinations of the years, months, and days from the significant dates they had identified, Dr. Thorne suggested a pattern based on her knowledge of 19th century secret societies. Try the day numbers only, the 17th for Westbrook, the 23rd for Mercer, and perhaps the year of the panic and the network completion, 57578. The stone discs turned reluctantly at first, then with increasing ease as decades of disuse gave way to their original precision engineering. When the final number clicked into place, a mechanism engaged somewhere within the door, and it slowly swung open on counterweighted hinges. "Incredible," Michael whispered, capturing images of the remarkable locking system. This level of security suggests whatever they were protecting held enormous significance. The flashlight beams revealed a rectangular chamber approximately 30 feet long and 20 feet wide, its ceiling arched and supported by regularly spaced columns. Unlike the rough stone of the main chamber and tunnels, this room featured finished walls with wooden shelving and cabinetry that had remained remarkably preserved in the stable underground environment. But it was the chamber's contents that left them momentarily speechless. The archive was exactly that, a meticulously organized repository of documents, ledgers, maps, and artifacts, all seemingly arranged by category and date. Central tables held larger items, including what appeared to be original architectural drawings of the entire network. "This is extraordinary," Dr. Thorne breathed, her historian's training immediately recognizing the significance of what they had found. "This isn't just family records, it's a comprehensive alternative history of the entire region." As they carefully examined the materials, the true purpose of the network began to emerge. Beyond the cooperative economic venture Ethan had already discovered in his grandfather's journal, the archive revealed a much more significant aspect of the underground system. It had served as a mechanism for documented resistance against powerful outside financial interests that had attempted to gain control of the region following the Civil War. One section contained ledgers documenting how banking consortiums from eastern cities had manipulated currency and credit availability to force both agricultural and industrial operations into debt, then attempted to seize control of local resources. The network families had responded by creating their own internal economy, moving goods, services, and even locally printed currency through the underground system to maintain independence. "Look at this," Ethan said, carefully examining maps that showed the network extending far beyond what they had imagined. It connected at least 12 properties throughout the county, farms, mills, workshops, and even the old courthouse. Michael photographed a particularly significant document, a manifesto of sorts signed by representatives of both agricultural and industrial families, including Thomas Mercer and William Westbrook. Dated 1868, it outlined their unified resistance against what they termed financial colonization by outside interests. "We hereby establish this network as both physical infrastructure and enduring testament to our belief that the prosperity of this region depends upon cooperation across all supposed boundaries. We reject the artificial divisions others would impose upon us and commit ourselves to mutual support, despite public perception of our differences. But most revealing were documents from the 1890s showing how powerful banking and development interests had eventually succeeded in re-establishing divisions between the farming and industrial communities. Having failed to defeat them directly, these outside entities had employed more subtle tactics, funding opposing political candidates, establishing separate social institutions, and gradually convincing each community that the other was responsible for their economic challenges. They couldn't break the alliance directly, Dr. Thorne observed, so they slowly manufactured division through generational change. By the time the network was officially sealed in 1919, the collaboration between founding families had been largely forgotten, replaced by the animosity that persists to this day. A leather-bound journal marked Final Testament, 1920, contained entries from both Westbrook and Mercer descendants explaining their difficult decision to seal the network and preserve its secrets for future generations. The county government, by then influenced by the same outside interests their grandparents had resisted, had used a partial collapse as justification to declare the entire network unsafe. Rather than risk exposing the full extent of the underground system to those who would destroy it, the families had chosen to seal and disguise the most significant chambers while maintaining private family records of their existence. "We conceal this archive not in surrender," the final entry read, "but in the hope that future generations may rediscover both its physical evidence and its fundamental truth. That prosperity divided cannot stand against adversity united. When the time comes that this knowledge may again serve the community rather than divide it, may our descendants find the courage to reveal what we must now conceal." Ethan felt the weight of that generational trust as they carefully documented the archive's contents. For hours, they methodically photographed documents, mapped the chamber's layout, and collected digital evidence of its most significant revelations. Michael's professional photography skills proved invaluable, ensuring they captured clear images of crucial historical evidence. "This completely transforms our understanding of regional development," Dr. Thorne said as they finished their documentation. "The divisions that have defined Riverdale County for generations, the political boundaries, the social separation between communities like Millfield and Cedar Springs, they were deliberately engineered by outside interests after initially being rejected by the founding families." As they prepared to reseal the archive for protection, Ethan discovered one final significant item, a small fireproof box positioned prominently on the central table. Inside lay original deeds and legal documents establishing a trust similar to what Martha had described, but far more extensive than they had imagined. This trust wasn't just for preserving knowledge, Ethan realized as he examined the yellowed papers. It established legal protection for all properties connected to the network if its existence was ever revealed, including provisions for financial resources to maintain those properties. Dawn was approaching as they carefully restored the archive chamber to its original condition, ensuring that if Commissioner Jenkins succeeded in gaining access, there would be no immediate evidence of their night's exploration. They reset the stone door's combination and re-locked the outer door, then rearranged the facade stones to maintain the appearance of a collapsed tunnel. Emerging from the underground chamber as the first light broke across Willow Creek Farm, Ethan felt both exhausted and exhilarated. They had uncovered a truth that challenged everything the community believed about its own history, evidence that the deepest divisions in Riverdale County had been manufactured rather than natural. "What do we do with this information?" Lily asked as they gathered in the farmhouse kitchen, reviewing the digital evidence they had secured. Margaret Westbrook, who had waited anxiously with Martha for their return, examined the photographs with growing amazement. "We take it to the commission hearing this afternoon," she said firmly. "It's time this community learned what really divided us and what might bring us back together." Jonathan Parker, the attorney Martha had contacted during their underground exploration, arrived mid-morning to review the documentation and trust documents they had discovered. His legal expertise confirmed what Ethan had begun to hope. The carefully preserved trust established by the network families remained legally valid. "This is extraordinary," Parker explained, examining the original documents and comparing them with county records he had accessed. The trust was structured with remarkable foresight, establishing contingencies that would activate upon rediscovery of the network. It essentially created a legal entity that has been dormant but continuously existing for over a century. "What does that mean for Willow Creek Farm?" Ethan asked, the foreclosure notice still weighing on his mind despite their historical discoveries. "It means the bank doesn't have the authority they think they do," Parker replied with growing confidence. "Your property, along with several others connected to the network, has been held in a special type of contingent ownership under the trust. The foreclosure proceeding is against you personally, but the trust has superior legal interest in the property itself." This revelation brought temporary relief from Ethan's most immediate financial concerns, but the afternoon's commission hearing still loomed. Commissioner Jenkins would undoubtedly have his own strategies for gaining control of the site, strategies likely coordinated with Victoria Blackwell and whatever interests she truly represented. As they prepared the historical evidence for presentation, Ethan reflected on the profound irony of his situation. The very land that had seemed an unbearable burden, a failing farm he had reluctantly returned to manage after his father's death, now represented something far more valuable than agricultural production. It preserved a historical truth, with the potential to heal community divisions that should have ended generations earlier. "Whatever happens at the hearing," he told Lily as they loaded documentation into Jonathan Parker's car, "I want you to know I'm proud of how you've approached this whole situation. You saw the value in our heritage before I did." Lily smiled, her expression reflecting a maturity beyond her 13 years. "Great-great-great-Grandpa Thomas would be proud of both of us, I think. We're doing exactly what he hoped his descendants would someday do." The Cedar Springs County Administration building was already crowded when they arrived, news of the underground discovery having spread throughout the region. Residents from both farming communities like Millfield and industrial centers like Cedar Springs filled the commission chambers, traditional divisions momentarily set aside in shared curiosity about the revelation that challenged their regional identity. Commissioner Jenkins sat at the center of the commission panel, his usual political confidence somewhat diminished by the unexpected public interest. Victoria Blackwell occupied a front row seat, surrounded by engineers and legal representatives from Oak Ridge Development. Their coordinated presence suggested they anticipated a favorable outcome. What they hadn't anticipated was the unified presentation that Ethan, Margaret Westbrook, and their allies had prepared. With Jonathan Parker providing legal framework, Dr. Thorne offering historical context, and Michael Sullivan's professional documentation providing compelling visual evidence, they revealed the true history of the network and its significance to Riverdale County's development. The audience reaction shifted from initial skepticism to growing amazement as the presentation continued. The evidence was simply too comprehensive, too well documented to dismiss. Photographs of original documents signed by revered founding families, architectural drawings showing the network's remarkable extent, and most significantly, clear evidence of how outside financial interests had deliberately manufactured the divisions that had defined the region for generations. When Victoria Blackwell attempted to redirect attention to safety concerns, Margaret Westbrook countered with engineering assessments from experts she had privately consulted, confirming the structural integrity of the main chambers they had already documented. Commissioner Jenkins, increasingly uncomfortable as the presentation undermined positions he had advocated for years, attempted to limit discussion to immediate safety considerations rather than historical implications. While this historical perspective is certainly interesting, he insisted, our primary responsibility is public safety. The potential hazards of these underground structures cannot be ignored. It was Martha Sullivan who delivered perhaps the most powerful moment of the hearing. The elderly woman rose slowly, supported by her grandson, and addressed the commission with quiet dignity. I have lived in Riverdale County for 82 years, she began. My entire life, I've heard that farming and industrial families have natural different interests. That communities like Millfield and Cedar Springs are simply different kinds of places with different values and priorities. I accepted these divisions as natural and inevitable, as most of us have. She gestured toward the documented evidence they had presented. What we've discovered beneath Willow Creek Farm proves these divisions weren't natural or inevitable at all. They were deliberately created by outside interests who found it easier to control divided communities than unified ones, and we've been living with the consequences of that manipulation for generations. Her words resonated with many in the audience, particularly older residents who had never questioned the traditional boundaries that defined regional relationships. The revelation that revered ancestors from both agricultural and industrial backgrounds had initially rejected these divisions in favor of cooperation challenged fundamental assumptions about community identity. The commission hearing extended for hours as residents offered perspectives, asked questions, and gradually absorbed the implications of what had been revealed. The technical discussion of safety concerns and historical preservation became secondary to a more profound community conversation about shared heritage and artificially imposed divisions. By late afternoon, the commission reached a decision that reflected the session's unexpected direction. They would establish a 90-day moratorium on any alterations to the Willow Creek Farm site, during which a comprehensive archaeological and historical assessment would be conducted. During this period, temporary preservation measures would secure both safety and historical integrity. More significantly, they established a community advisory board representing both agricultural and industrial interests to oversee the assessment process and develop recommendations for long-term preservation of the network and its historical significance. For Ethan, the Commission's decision provided breathing room, but represented only the beginning of a longer process. As the hearing concluded, and people lingered to discuss the day's revelations, Victoria Blackwell approached him with a markedly different demeanor than in their previous interactions. Mr. Mercer, she said, her corporate polish somewhat diminished. It appears Oak Ridge's interest in your property was based on incomplete information provided by certain local connections. Her glance toward Commissioner Jenkins conveyed volumes about their prior arrangement. Our investors would be interested in discussing a different type of development opportunity, perhaps a heritage center that would preserve the network, while creating economic opportunities for the community. Ethan recognized the tactical adjustment of someone recalculating their position, but he also sensed a genuine reassessment. Any future discussions would need to include all stakeholders, particularly the Historical Society and Network family representatives, he replied. As Victoria departed, Margaret Westbrook joined Ethan, her aristocratic composure masking the emotional impact of the day's events. "My grandfather would have been gratified to see this day," she said quietly. "He maintained our family records, knowing this truth would eventually emerge, though he couldn't have known it would take generations." Together, they watched as residents from traditionally separated communities engaged in animated conversations, historical boundaries temporarily set aside as they processed revelations about their shared heritage. The manufactured divisions hadn't disappeared in a single afternoon, but the first cracks in long-established perceptions had definitely formed. "What happens now?" Lily asked as they prepared to return to Willow Creek Farm, the immediate crisis averted, but longer-term questions still unresolved. Ethan considered the journey they had begun, one that extended far beyond his personal concerns about the farm's financial viability. "Now we continue uncovering the truth," he replied. "Not just about the physical network, but about how communities can reclaim connections that should never have been broken." As evening shadows lengthened across the fields of Willow Creek Farm, Ethan stood at the secured entrance to the underground chambers, reflecting on the unexpected path that had led him here. What had begun as a desperate struggle to maintain a failing family farm had evolved into something he could never have anticipated: the rediscovery of a historical truth with the potential to transform an entire community's understanding of itself. The land that had seemed an unbearable burden now represented something far more valuable than agricultural production alone. It preserved evidence of cooperation across supposedly unbridgeable divides, a legacy of resistance against those who profited from manufacturing division, and most importantly, a template for how artificial separations might once again be overcome. In Thomas Mercer's final journal entry, written decades after the network had been sealed, Ethan found words that seemed to speak directly across generations. "We preserve this truth beneath the soil, knowing we may not live to see its revelation. But we trust that when the time comes, it will prove more valuable than any harvest our land could ever yield." The accidental discovery beneath Willow Creek Farm had revealed exactly that: a harvest of historical truth with the potential to nurture reconciliation where division had too long prevailed. The morning after the county commission hearing, Willow Creek Farm awakened to an unexpected atmosphere of possibility. The 90-day moratorium on any development decisions had provided breathing room, but it also brought new responsibilities. As Ethan Mercer stepped onto the farmhouse porch with his morning coffee, he found the property already bustling with activity. The archaeological team, led by Professor Rivera, had arrived early, eager to begin the comprehensive documentation now officially sanctioned by the county. "We'll need to establish a systematic grid pattern for the entire north field," the professor explained, spreading detailed maps across a folding table. "Ground-penetrating radar suggests the network extends far beyond what we've already accessed. There appear to be at least 3 major chambers, connected by tunnel systems running in different directions." Dr. Eleanor Thorne had arrived with additional historical preservation specialists from the state office, their equipment van loaded with sophisticated documentation tools. The moratorium had triggered emergency funding for proper historical assessment, a significant upgrade from their initial makeshift exploration. The State Historical Society is assembling a special committee focused specifically on the network, she told Ethan. "What you've discovered has implications far beyond Riverdale County. It represents a previously undocumented form of community, resistance to financial colonization during the post-Civil War era." Most surprising was the presence of a television news van from the regional station and a reporter from the Cedar Springs Chronicle. The discovery beneath Willow Creek Farm had captured public imagination in ways Ethan hadn't anticipated. transforming from local curiosity to regional news almost overnight. "Dad, there are even more people coming up the driveway," Lily called. From the kitchen window, a caravan of vehicles was indeed approaching, some belonging to other academic institutions responding to Professor Rivera's collegial outreach. Others filled with curious community members drawn by the morning's news reports. "We need some kind of management system here," Ethan realized, the scale of interest suddenly overwhelming. This is still an active archaeological site with safety concerns. Jonathan Parker, who had arrived to discuss the trust documentation in more detail, offered a practical suggestion. The trust provisions actually anticipated public interest if the network was rediscovered. There's specific language about establishing visitor protocols while maintaining site integrity. Within hours, they had implemented basic visitor management, designated parking areas away from the excavation site, guided viewing areas at safe distances, and scheduled information sessions where Professor Rivera and Dr. Thorne explained the historical significance of what had been discovered. Lily enthusiastically volunteered to help coordinate these efforts, her natural enthusiasm for the farm's history making her an effective guide for visitors. By mid-afternoon, Ethan found a moment to step back and observe the transformation taking place on his property. The failing farm that had represented financial burden and generational obligation had suddenly become something entirely different, a nexus for community engagement and historical reconsideration. The very land he had considered abandoning now hummed with purpose. "Quite the change from yesterday, isn't it?" Margaret Westbrook commented, joining him beneath the ancient oak tree that had shaded generations of Mercers. Despite her aristocratic bearing, she had rolled up her sleeves to help organize historical documents being catalogued in the farmhouse living room. Last week, this was just a struggling farm. Today, it's the most significant historical site in the county. "It's still a struggling farm," Ethan reminded her, the practical challenges not entirely erased by historical discovery. The moratorium stopped immediate development threats, but it didn't magically solve the underlying financial issues. Margaret's expression suggested she might have additional insights on that front, but their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of an unexpected visitor. Victoria Blackwell's black SUV pulled into the makeshift parking area, but rather than emerging alone, she was accompanied by an older man whose elegant attire and commanding presence immediately suggested significant authority. "That's Charles Montgomery," Margaret whispered, recognition and surprise evident in her voice. "Chairman of Heartland Heritage Foundation. They fund major historical preservation projects throughout the Midwest." Victoria approached with uncharacteristic deference to her companion, her corporate demeanor subdued compared to previous encounters. "Mr. Mercer, may I introduce Charles Montgomery?" Mr. Montgomery expressed particular interest in your discovery after our development team's preliminary reports reached his attention. The distinguished man extended his hand with genuine warmth. "Ms. Blackwell has been forthcoming about Oak Ridge's initial interest in your property. I hope you'll allow me to offer a different perspective on potential preservation approaches." This surprising development led to an impromptu meeting in the farmhouse kitchen, the humble space now hosting Ethan, Margaret Westbrook, Jonathan Parker, Dr. Thorne, Professor Rivera, and their unexpected corporate visitors. The contrast between Montgomery's bespoke suit and the weathered farm table where they gathered wasn't lost on anyone. The Heartland Heritage Foundation specializes in sustainable preservation, Montgomery explained, accepting the coffee Lily served with gracious appreciation. "We believe historical sites should be economically viable while maintaining their integrity. Your discovery presents a rather exceptional opportunity on both fronts." Victoria Blackwell, now positioned as facilitator rather than adversary, outlined a conceptual approach that differed dramatically from Oak Ridge's initial development plans. After reviewing the historical documentation and community response, our investors recognize that the network's preservation could actually generate more sustainable value than conventional development. The proposal they presented was both unexpected and intriguing. A partnership between Oak Ridge's development resources, the Heartland Heritage Foundation's preservation expertise, and the Network Family Trust Jonathan had been working to formally reactivate. Rather than transforming the farmland into commercial property, they proposed establishing what Montgomery called a living historical site that would preserve both the underground network and the agricultural heritage above it. The model combines active agricultural operations using both historical and contemporary sustainable methods with educational tourism centered around the network, Montgomery explained. Similar approaches have proven financially viable in other regions while preserving historical integrity. Professor Rivera, initially skeptical of any corporate involvement, found himself engaged by the archaeological preservation elements of the proposal. The subterranean chambers could be properly secured for both protection and limited public access, similar to approaches used at significant cave system sites. Dr. Thorne was similarly intrigued by the educational possibilities. The network's historical significance extends beyond the physical structures to the narrative of community resistance it represents. That story deserves broader recognition. Ethan listened carefully, weighing practical considerations against his growing sense of responsibility to the historical legacy his ancestors had preserved. This sounds promising, but ownership and control would be critical issues. My primary concern is ensuring this history isn't commercialized in ways that distort its significance. Jonathan Parker, who had been quietly reviewing documentation during the discussion, offered important context. The trust structure actually anticipated something similar to what Mr. Montgomery is suggesting. There are provisions for educational cultivation of the property that maintain family stewardship, while allowing broader public engagement. Victoria Blackwell, demonstrating remarkable adaptability, presented financial projections showing how such an approach could resolve Willow Creek Farm's immediate economic challenges while establishing sustainable operations moving forward. Our analysts believe a properly structured heritage center could generate sufficient revenue to maintain both the historical site and active agricultural operations. Margaret Westbrook, who had been observing the discussion with thoughtful consideration, finally spoke. The Westbrook Foundation would be interested in participating as well. This representation of our shared history deserves proper support from both founding families. As the meeting concluded with agreements to develop more detailed proposals, Ethan found himself in an entirely unexpected position. The property that had represented financial burden and potential loss just days ago now stood at the center of preservation interest from multiple directions. The 90-day moratorium had created space for possibilities he couldn't have imagined when the sinkhole first appeared in his north field. That evening, after the visitors had departed and the archaeological team had secured the excavation site, for the night, Ethan and Lily sat on the farmhouse porch, watching fireflies rise from the fields that had sustained their family for generations. "Do you think we'll still be farmers if all these plans happen?" Lily asked, the question reflecting her remarkable ability to focus on practical essentials. "I think we'll be farmers and something more," Ethan replied after consideration. "Stewards of the land and the history it contains. Not so different from what the Mercers have always been, just more conscious of it." Lily nodded, satisfied with this perspective. Great-great-great-grandpa Thomas would like that, I think. The following days brought increasing activity as the archaeological assessment continued with expanded resources. Professor Rivera's team had established a comprehensive documentation system for mapping the entire network, using non-invasive technologies to identify chambers and tunnels before careful physical exploration. The archive chamber remained their secret for now. Ethan had discussed its existence only with those directly involved in their nighttime exploration. They had agreed to complete more comprehensive documentation of the main chamber and accessible tunnels before revealing the archive's existence, ensuring its contents would receive proper professional attention rather than rushed examination. Community interest continued to grow, with visitors from throughout the region arriving daily to learn about the discovery. Ethan was particularly struck by how the historical revelations were prompting reconsideration of long-established community relationships. Farmers from Millfield and factory workers from Cedar Springs found themselves engaged in conversations about shared heritage rather than traditional divisions. Martha Sullivan, whose health had limited her direct involvement in the excavation, had established an oral history recording station in the farmhouse parlor, collecting testimonies from elderly residents whose family stories contained fragments of knowledge about the network. These recollections, previously dismissed as folk tales or exaggerations, now found validation in the physical evidence beneath Willow Creek Farm. "My grandfather used to say you could walk from Cedar Springs to Millfield without ever seeing daylight," one elderly visitor recounted. "We always thought he was spinning tall tales. Turns out he was telling the literal truth." A week after the commission hearing, Jonathan Parker arrived with news that fundamentally changed Ethan's personal circumstances. The attorney had completed his investigation of the trust documentation they had discovered in the archive, confirming its legal validity through county records and judicial review. "The Network Family Trust technically never ceased to exist," Jonathan explained, as they reviewed the formal legal notice he had prepared. "It became dormant when the network was sealed, but the provisions for reactivation upon rediscovery were legally sound. The trust has priority claim on Willow Creek Farm that supersedes the bank's mortgage interest." "What does that mean in practical terms?" Ethan asked, struggling to grasp the implications. "It means the foreclosure proceedings are legally invalid," Jonathan replied, with evident satisfaction. "More importantly, the trust contains financial resources accumulated over decades, investments that were structured to provide maintenance funding if the network was ever rediscovered." This revelation transformed Ethan's personal financial crisis overnight. Rather than facing imminent loss of his family property, he now held a position as designated steward of a historically significant site with resources to maintain it. The failing farm that had represented unbearable financial burden had suddenly become sustainably viable through its historical significance. The bank officials who had previously sent threatening foreclosure notices now approached with respectful accommodation, eager to maintain positive relationships with what had become the county's most prominent historical site. The irony wasn't lost on Ethan. The very land that financial institutions had been ready to seize now represented value they hadn't recognized until others identified it. As the second week of archaeological assessment began, Professor Rivera made a discovery that expanded their understanding of the network's extent. Ground-penetrating radar had identified a previously unknown tunnel extending southeast from the main chamber, a direction that didn't align with any of the connections documented in the maps they had discovered. "This pathway doesn't appear on any of the network documentation," the professor noted as they reviewed the scanning results. "It's narrower than the other tunnels and appears to have been constructed using slightly different techniques." With proper safety protocols in place, Professor Rivera led a small exploration team, including Ethan and Dr. Thorne, to investigate this anomalous feature. The tunnel was indeed distinct from others they had documented, its construction more rudimentary and its passage significantly narrower, requiring careful navigation. After approximately 200 yards, the tunnel opened into a small chamber. Unlike the precisely constructed spaces they had previously discovered, this room had earthen walls, reinforced with wooden supports rather than stone masonry, and contained simple sleeping pallets, food storage areas, and evidence of long-term habitation. "This isn't part of the original network design," Dr. Thorne observed, examining artifacts that had remained undisturbed for well over a century. "This appears to be a refuge of some kind." The chamber's purpose became clear when they discovered a hidden compartment containing documents preserved in sealed metal containers. These papers included manumission certificates, travel passes, and hand-drawn maps of routes leading northward, unmistakable evidence of underground railroad activities. The network wasn't just for economic cooperation, Ethan realized. The historical significance expanding before them. At least part of it served as an underground railroad station. This discovery added entirely new dimensions to the historical narrative emerging from beneath. Willow Creek Farm. The network families hadn't just cooperated across economic divides, they had actively participated in resistance against slavery, using their underground infrastructure to support freedom seekers moving northward. Most significant was documentation showing this activity had continued well after the Civil War officially ended, providing safe passage for formerly enslaved people facing continuing dangers during the Reconstruction era. Letters between Thomas Mercer and William Westbrook discussed travelers requiring assistance as late as 1870. Suggesting their cooperation had encompassed moral purposes beyond economic interests. This explains additional security measures we've observed in certain sections, Professor Rivera noted. The disguised entrances and false passages weren't just protecting economic activities. They were shielding people whose safety depended on absolute secrecy. Dr. Thorne carefully documented everything they found, recognizing its profound historical significance. This connects the network to national patterns of resistance rather than just regional economic cooperation. It represents a much more comprehensive rejection of the post-Civil War power structures than we initially understood. When they shared these findings with Margaret Westbrook, her composed aristocratic demeanor momentarily faltered. "My family," records mentioned humanitarian activities without specific details. "I had assumed this referred to local charity efforts during economic hardships. This is..." She paused, visibly moved. "This is a proud legacy I never knew we carried." News of this additional historical dimension reached Charles Montgomery at the Heartland Heritage Foundation, intensifying his organization's interest in proper preservation. "This significantly elevates the network's historical importance," he explained during a follow-up visit. "It represents intersection between economic resistance and moral conviction that's rarely documented so comprehensively." Victoria Blackwell, continuing her remarkable transition from development adversary to preservation ally, arranged for specialized conservation experts to assess the newly discovered chamber. "This requires particular sensitivity in both preservation and eventual presentation," she acknowledged. "The human stories represented here carry special significance." The Underground Railroad connection attracted attention from national historical organizations, bringing additional resources and expertise to the documentation efforts. What had begun as a local archaeological project was evolving into a multifaceted historical assessment with significance beyond regional boundaries. For Ethan, each new discovery deepened his connection to the land his family had maintained for generations. The failing farm that had once represented burden and limitation now revealed itself as the preservation of something far more valuable than agricultural production. A physical repository of moral courage and community cooperation that had been deliberately erased from public memory. Midway through the initial 90-day assessment period, Jonathan Parker completed the legal reactivation of the Network Family Trust, establishing formal protocols for ongoing preservation and management. The trust structure created shared stewardship between descendant families while maintaining Willow Creek Farm as the physical center of the historical site. Your role as resident steward maintains the Mercer family's traditional connection to the land, Jonathan explained as Ethan reviewed the finalized documentation. But the preservation responsibilities are now shared among all network descendant families, with resources pooled for proper maintenance. This arrangement resolved Ethan's personal financial challenges while establishing sustainable long-term protection for the historical discovery. The Trust's accumulated resources proved substantial enough to maintain both the archaeological site and continued agricultural operations, creating the living historical center Charles Montgomery had envisioned. Most gratifying for Ethan was watching the gradual transformation in community relationships as knowledge of the network's history spread throughout the region. The carefully documented evidence of historical cooperation between supposedly opposed factions prompted reconsideration of contemporary divisions that had long been accepted as inevitable. We've always assumed Millfield and Cedar Springs were naturally different communities with opposing interests, remarked the editor of the Cedar Springs Chronicle in a thoughtful editorial. Perhaps it's time we questioned whether those differences serve our collective prosperity or primarily benefit interests beyond our region. Small but meaningful interactions began occurring regularly. Joint community events between previously separated towns, collaborative economic initiatives between agricultural and industrial interests, and educational programs that emphasized shared regional heritage rather than traditional divisions. The County Commission, now chaired by a more progressive member following Commissioner Jenkins's quieter involvement, established a regional planning committee with equal representation from agricultural and industrial communities. Their first initiative focused on identifying economic development approaches that would benefit the entire region rather than reinforcing traditional boundaries. Victoria Blackwell, demonstrating remarkable adaptability, positioned Oak Ridge Development as a facilitator for this more unified approach. Sustainable development requires understanding the authentic character and heritage of a community, she explained during a regional business forum. The network's history offers valuable lessons about cooperation across perceived boundaries. Even Commissioner Jenkins, whose initial opposition had been so pronounced, found ways to align himself with the preservation efforts as their popularity grew. "I always believed this discovery deserved proper assessment," he claimed during public appearances, his political instincts recognizing the shifting landscape. For Lily, the transformation of Willow Creek Farm had opened unexpected opportunities. Her natural aptitude for explaining historical connections to visitors had evolved into a formal role with the educational programs being developed. Local schools were already scheduling field trips for the coming academic year, eager to incorporate the network's history into their curriculum. "I never thought I'd enjoy living on a farm this much," she confessed to Ethan one evening as they walked the perimeter of the North Field where archaeological work continued. "But this isn't just a farm anymore, is it? It's something bigger." Ethan considered her observation, watching the sunset illuminate the land that had sustained his family for generations. "It was always something bigger," he replied. "We just didn't recognize what we were preserving." As the initial assessment period neared its conclusion, Ethan found himself reflecting on the remarkable journey that had begun with a simple sinkhole following heavy spring rains. The failing farm that had represented financial burden and potential loss had revealed itself as the preservation of something far more valuable. A physical repository of historical truth that challenged established narratives and offered templates for reconsidering contemporary divisions. Charles Montgomery captured this perspective eloquently during a planning meeting for the Heritage Center that would eventually occupy portions of the property. What makes the network discovery so powerful isn't just its historical significance, but its contemporary relevance. It demonstrates that divisions we accept as natural or inevitable are often constructed and maintained for particular interests. This recognition represented the most profound legacy of what had been uncovered beneath Willow Creek Farm. Not just historical artifacts and hidden chambers, but evidence that cooperation across supposed boundaries was possible because it had happened before. The network families had rejected artificial divisions when they threatened collective prosperity, creating literal underground connections where above-ground separation was enforced. 3 months after the initial discovery, the State Historical Commission convened a special hearing to consider permanent historical designation for the network site. The proceeding was largely ceremonial, given the overwhelming evidence and community support for preservation, but it represented formal recognition of the discovery's significance. The network represents a previously undocumented form of community organization that challenges established historical narratives about post-Civil War development, Dr. Thorne testified, presenting the comprehensive documentation they had assembled. Its physical infrastructure embodies resistance to economic colonization, while its documented activities demonstrate moral cooperation across supposed boundaries. Margaret Westbrook, speaking on behalf of the industrial families connected to the network, emphasized its contemporary relevance. What our ancestors created wasn't simply a physical infrastructure, but a model of cooperation that we would do well to reconsider in addressing modern challenges. They recognized that manufactured division serves interests beyond our community. Martha Sullivan, whose husband's role as a knowledge keeper had preserved crucial information about the network, offered perhaps the most powerful testimony despite her frail health. For generations, we accepted the story that our communities were naturally divided by different interests and values. What we've discovered beneath Willow Creek Farm isn't just historical curiosity. It's liberation from a narrative that never truly served us. The Commission's unanimous approval of permanent historical designation was met with applause from the gathered community members, many of whom represented families that had maintained artificial separation for generations. The dividing lines hadn't disappeared entirely, but they had become permeable in ways previously unimaginable. For Ethan personally, the formal designation represented resolution of the crisis that had consumed him when the sinkhole first appeared. In his north field, the failing farm that had threatened financial ruin had transformed into a sustainably viable operation through its historical significance, allowing him to maintain his family's connection to the land while sharing its deeper importance with the broader community. As he stood at the edge of the excavation site that evening, watching the last light fade from Willow Creek Farm's fields, Ethan felt a profound connection to the generations of Mercers who had maintained this land not just for agricultural production, but as the preservation of historical truth. They had survived economic hardships and maintained their stewardship, not knowing precisely what they protected, only that it deserved protection until the right moment for revelation. That moment had arrived through an accident of nature, heavy rains and collapsing earth, revealing what had been deliberately hidden, But the response to that revelation had been conscious choice. The decision to investigate rather than bury, to document rather than develop, to share rather than privatize historical truth. "Dad?" Lily called from the farmhouse porch. "Martha and Michael are here with more oral histories they've collected, and Professor Rivera wants to discuss the preservation plan for the main chamber." Ethan took a final look at the fertile fields that stretched toward the horizon, land that had sustained his family through generations of challenge and change. The north field that had opened to reveal hidden chambers would never again be simply agricultural land, but it would continue, nourishing the community in ways his ancestors had intended when they first established the network. "Coming?" he called back, turning toward the farmhouse that now served as both home and historical center. The burden he had reluctantly accepted had revealed itself as privilege, the opportunity to preserve and share truth that might heal. Divisions long accepted as permanent. The sinkhole that had threatened his future had instead opened passage to the past, revealing not just historical chambers, but possibilities for community reconnection across boundaries that no longer needed to define them. 5 years had passed since the sinkhole first appeared in the north field of Willow Creek Farm. On this crisp autumn morning, Ethan Mercer stood at the edge of what was now known throughout the region as the Riverdale Network Heritage Center. Yellow and orange leaves drifted down from ancient oaks that had witnessed generations of Mercers working this land, now transformed into something none of them could have imagined. Where once a struggling farmer had faced imminent foreclosure, today stood the director of a nationally recognized historical site. The weathered farmhouse remained Ethan and Lily's home, but the surrounding property had evolved into a living museum that welcomed thousands of visitors annually. The underground chambers, carefully preserved and selectively opened for guided tours, told a story that had changed how an entire community understood its past. "Dad, the governor's car just arrived," called Lily, now 18, and preparing to study historical preservation at the State University. Her childhood enthusiasm for family heritage had blossomed into academic passion and purpose. "And the documentary crew is setting up by the main chamber entrance." Ethan nodded, straightening his tie as he prepared to welcome the distinguished visitors gathering for the ceremony. Today marked the official dedication of the Riverdale Network as a national historic landmark, the culmination of years of documentation, preservation, and community reconciliation. Margaret Westbrook approached, her aristocratic bearing softened by genuine warmth that had developed through their years of collaboration. The board members have all arrived, and Martha insisted on attending despite her doctor's concerns. "Some things are more important than comfort," she says. The elderly Martha Sullivan, now confined to a wheelchair at 87, had lived to see the knowledge her husband had preserved finally acknowledged and celebrated. As one of the last living connections to the original knowledge keepers, her presence at today's ceremony carried particular significance. Victoria Blackwell joined them, her corporate ambitions having transformed into genuine dedication to sustainable heritage development. "The economic impact report is complete," she said, handing Ethan a folder. "The network site has generated more regional value through heritage tourism and educational programs than conventional development ever would have. Even my board of directors has to acknowledge that preservation proved more profitable than demolition." As they walked toward the ceremony area, Ethan marveled at the gathered crowd. Residents from both Millfield and Cedar Springs mingled without the careful separation that had once defined their interactions. The documented evidence of historical cooperation between supposedly opposed communities had prompted reconsideration of divisions long accepted as natural and inevitable. The ceremony itself was brief but meaningful. The governor, recognizing the political value of association with the popular historical site, spoke about lessons from the past informing regional development. Jonathan Parker, representing the network, family trust that now included 22 descendant families, emphasized the ongoing stewardship of both physical structures and historical narrative. Professor Rivera, who had directed the archaeological preservation, detailed the site's unique historical significance. When Ethan's turn came to speak, he found himself reflecting on the journey that had transformed both his personal circumstances and the broader community. 5 years ago, I stood in that field watching rainwater disappear into what I thought was just another crisis threatening my family's legacy, he began. What emerged wasn't just historical chambers and tunnels, but fundamental questions about narratives we've accepted without examination. He gestured toward the restored farmland surrounding the preserved chambers. My ancestors didn't just build underground passages. They created physical evidence that cooperation across supposed boundaries served their prosperity better than separation. They recognized that divisions presented as natural often served interests beyond our community. As the ceremonial ribbon was cut and the landmark plaque unveiled, Ethan felt the weight of generational purpose fulfilled. Thomas Mercer's final journal entry echoed in his mind. We preserve this truth beneath the soil, knowing we may not live to see its revelation. But we trust that when the time comes, it will prove more valuable than any harvest our land could ever yield. The accidental discovery beneath Willow Creek Farm had yielded exactly that, a harvest of historical understanding with the potential to nurture cooperation where manufactured division had too long prevailed. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.